So this talk here is going to be dealing with energy and matter and how those happen to move through ecosystems. So we're going to be looking at how chemistry and physics turn out to both be involved in ecosystems and what they happen to do in each. There's quite a few learning objectives that show up on the AP Bio test that comes from this, and those are the references from the textbook. So there's lots of interactions that occur within an ecosystem, which makes sense because we're dealing with lots of different parts. So you have the living and the non-living, which gives you one level of interaction. Then you can start making different types of living things inside of that area, which will cause another type of interaction. And then you could have large groupings of these, which is a different level of interaction. And each of those interactions turns out to play a little bit different. Some of them help control population size, some of them control what the climate turns out to be, but there's lots of interactions. Typically the interactions that we think of show up at the level of what we call trophic levels. Trophic, the word troph means to eat or nourishment. So different trophic levels are different areas or different levels of what eats what. The first trophic level is usually where's the energy produced, so what's the main or the original food source. Second trophic level, or what we call a primary consumer, eats those producers. Secondary consumer will eat whatever is the primary. Tertiary will eat whatever is the secondary, and it just kind of keeps building up. But we could also call that first trophic level, second trophic level, third trophic level, fourth trophic level. The interactions typically are very complex. We give them the name of a food web. The reason why they're a web is because it's not one thing eats only one other thing. It's usually you eat lots of different things, which eat a whole bunch, or are eaten by a whole bunch of other different things. So the webs tend to be very complex. If you were to follow along any one, so like the one on here on the left, if you were to go to kelp, to a sea urchin, to a sea otter, one of those series of lines would give the name of a food chain. And if you have a food chain that is also the food web, you can get predator-prey cycles. But typically, it's not just a food chain, it's a whole network of things. One of the things that shows up with these complex interactions is there's usually some type of organism that kind of holds it all together. There's something that maintains the balance. And if you remove that organism, the entire network, the entire food web collapses on you. The community collapses. We give that thing the name of a keystone species. Keystone meaning it's the base corner of any type of building that if you were to take it away, everything else falls apart. It's the starting point or the most important one single piece inside of the building, or in this particular case, single organism inside of a community where everything's interacting. The only way that you can identify a keystone species is when they die. So if you were to eliminate them and then the ecosystem collapses, that means that congratulations, you killed off the keystone species. When we look at those different trophic levels, what we notice is the energy content inside of organisms decreases, meaning if I were to burn whatever it is, I don't get as much energy out of each ascending level, meaning the most energy I can ever consume is going to be in the primary level. The next most amount of energy will be in the second, the third most amount of energy will be in the third trophic level, fourth amount would be in the fourth trophic level. And what we tend to notice is there's a limitation as to how many trophic levels you can really go. And the reason for that is not all of the energy gets transferred along. This is actually referred to as the second law of thermodynamics. And do I have a slide on it? No, I don't. But something referred to as the 90% rule, and we'll come back to the 90% rule later when we deal more with the chemistry of what's happening here. But the 90% rule basically says if you have 100% in the first trophic level, only 90% or 90% of it goes away. So 10% moves on to the next trophic level. So in this picture here, there's 1,000 kilocalories, you would call that 1,000 calories, available to consume with the plants, the producers. The grasshoppers, the primary consumer or the second trophic level, those only, if you were to look at their energy content, they turn out to be 100 calories. If you look at the moles above them, they turn out to only have 10 calories, and then if you look at the owl at the top, it has 1 calorie. So 10% moves on, 90% goes away. And that turns out to follow thermodynamics, which is an insanely fundamental law of physics. Because of that, you get rather odd interactions. But the thing is, even the apex predator, so the thing way up at the top, in this particular case would be on the 5th trophic level, all of those, even those organisms, they get fed somewhere. And where all that comes from is they get eaten up by decomposers. We don't have bodies lying around. You get consumed. So everything gets eaten by decomposers, and what that allows for is a recycling of nutrients. In all of these cases, some of the food, some of the energy is going to get lost, and by some I mean most, and the way that it gets lost is in the form of heat. The way that we stay warm is we eat food and then we burn it, like it's on fire. So it's keeping us warm, it's maintaining a temperature for us so that we can do whatever we're going to do. Those decomposers, like I said, they're meant to recycle stuff, but we usually don't look at them when we think of food webs just because they're just ubiquitous, meaning they're always there. What we notice, or one of the ways that we can look at this, is we can view energy content in what we call biomass. So how many grams do you produce, or how much mass do you end up accumulating over a certain amount of time? And we could also convert that into energy if we still feel like it, kilocalories or calories. But typically we talk about, well, how much mass do you gain by eating so much food? And what we end up seeing is we can make a chart that looks like this, which is a biomass pyramid. We're going to do something very similar with the lab, the energy dynamics lab. We won't necessarily be able to talk about all of the things that's going on, so we'll have to sit there and say, oh, well, something's happening, so what is that? And then we'll answer that question later. But we'll notice that, there seems to be a pattern, and not everything that gets eaten shows up in terms of weight. Meaning, if you eat 5 pounds of food, you're not going to gain 5 pounds of weight. So something's going on. Like I said, when you die, or anything dies, we have to recycle the parts. And we call that a nutrient cycle. And nutrients have to recycle because that's a chemistry principle called the conservation of matter, which is basically all the atoms get to stay around. So you are made out of dinosaurs, and you're made out of trilobites, and you're made out of Einstein's breath and stuff like that. And the reason why is there's only so much stuff. We only have so many atoms on the earth, and you got to be made out of whatever's there. So organisms from before you died, they were decomposed, their parts became part of you. The way that we look at that entire series of, well, how does it move back and forth, are what we call nutrient cycles, and there's several famous ones. This one here would be what we call the carbon-oxygen cycle. So carbon, like carbon dioxide, the stuff that we breathe out, we can breathe out, goes out into the air. We burn stuff, goes out into the air. What trees are capable of doing is taking content of the air and turning it into food. So we have that, we eat the food, now we put the carbon back into us. We could also shuffle with oxygen. So we will take food and we'll take water and we'll liberate oxygen into the world. Things like plants will then take the oxygen and they'll turn it, let me get that totally backwards. Oxygen will do the exact opposite. So what plants will do is they will take water and rip it apart and turn it into oxygen. And then when you look at us, we will take that oxygen and shove it back into water. So the carbon cycle, we make the part that plants then use, that we then consume. Plants, when it comes to oxygen, will sit there and they will take stuff that they consume, water, release oxygen that we will then take and turn back into water. That isn't to say that plants don't do any of that carbon stuff, so they will actually they'll take organic things and release CO2 as well, but it's complicated, and we'll talk about all that stuff later. The water cycle is also a famous one. I'm sure you talked about this one in apes. So you have some type of water going from a liquid state to a vapor state. Once you have enough of that, it's going to start to form clouds, and then it's going to dump out. We call that precipitation. The way that we can get the water up into the air can be either evaporation, or there's a plant version, which is called transpiration, or you have the animal and plant and everything else version, which is just us breathing out. We release water. It's why if you keep your mouth open for a long period of time, your mouth dries out. So we get runoff, so we get precipitation. That water is going to go somewhere, either into the ground or into a body of water, and the cycle just continues. Nitrogen turns out to be rather complicated. You have nitrogen in the air. Most of what we breathe is nitrogen. Nitrogen by itself, N2, doesn't do anything. So to turn it into something useful, you have to have nitrifying bacteria, or what they can do is what we call fixing nitrogen. So when you fix something, that means you turn something from being useless to being useful. So there are certain bacteria that can sit there and take nitrogen out of the air and turn it into something that we can consume. Much like how you'll also have bacteria that can turn useful nitrogen back into useless nitrogen. That's called denitrification. But typically once we get nitrogen in the form that's useful, we just kind of keep using it up until there's an organism that gets rid of it. Then you could have cycles that are what we call long cycles. So nitrogen cycles relatively fast. The carbon-oxygen cycle is pretty fast. The water cycle is pretty fast. Some, like sulfur and phosphorus, which turn out to be really important for us as well, these take a long time because phosphorus and sulfur tend to get trapped in rocks, and rocks take a long time to fall apart. So the result is the movement from living to non-living, it's a much, much longer cycle. So with these last 4 pictures, you're going to sit there and become tempted to, I need to memorize all of these. No, you don't need to memorize them at all. It's a matter of, are you aware that there are lots of things going on? And if you know the chemical processes, which we don't yet, you can start to connect the dots.